So I graduated from college in 1983, and I decided I wanted to be a neurologist after I qualified. So after my internship, I went straight into neurology, and I did 2 years in Ireland, and then I did my training in the US. And where I was in the US was a big centre for MS. So it was a big MS research program that did early clinical trials at that time. And one of the things about being a neurologist at that time, there were very few people who trained in neurology at that time. In fact, there was very few in Ireland. We had to go away to train. You couldn't train in Ireland. And most, or pretty much all neurological conditions were untreatable. So there's a kind of a view that if you want to be a neurologist, you'd be very good at diagnosis, and it'd be intellectually challenging to be a diagnostician. But the possibility of actually being able to make a difference in terms of treatment just wasn't there. So a lot of people didn't go into neurology because it was perceived as a condition or as a discipline in which you just couldn't do anything for people. So that wasn't my view, actually. But when I started, it was the case for MS that people got MS. We had no MRIs at the time, so MS was diagnosed on the clinical story and the clinical examination. And we just about had CTs. We had one CT in the city when I was an intern. So it was a diagnosis a little bit difficult to make sometimes, but there were no treatments. The only treatment at that time was if you had a relapse, you get steroids, and that was about it. So when I started out, people had relapsing, remitting, or secondary progressive MS, and we couldn't predict who would have very severe MS and who wouldn't. We couldn't predict, but in general, it was not a good diagnosis to have because people were just going to get worse and have relapses, and the uncertainty around the relapse was enormous. And when I did my residency training in the US, I went in 1986, we were doing clinical trials over there, the centres and the Brigham and Women's Hospital, later at Harvard. There were a number of clinical trials underway, but they were using really, really, really heavy-duty drugs that really made people very sick. And I developed a lifelong aversion to those sorts of clinical trials that make people really, really sick. So, but by around the late 80s and coming into the early 90s, two things happened. One is that MRI scans became much more available. The technology had been developed in the 1980s, and it was available in clinical practice by the early 90s. There were a few scanners around. It was hard to get, and they're very expensive. But by the early to the mid-90s in Ireland, we had MRI scanners, and I came back in the early 90s. And the other thing that happened was that the beginning of the new therapies was on the horizon, and that was really exciting. So there were treatments that looked like they could reduce the number of relapses that people had for MS, and even though those treatments had a lot of side effects and they didn't really hold the disease to the extent that we would have liked, it was a game changer for the disease. Because once you get a handle on something that might make a difference in a disease, then you can start building on that. You've got a little leverage, you've got a little wedge, and you can start building on. So if this mechanism works, how can we refine the drugs in terms of the better mechanisms if we understand this? At the same time this was happening, there was a revolution in our understanding of immunology, because we know that MS is an immunological disorder. It's a disorder where the innate immune system, the immune system that we have within our central nervous system, becomes activated for reasons that aren't very well understood, but we have a better understanding now. And it starts damaging the lining of the nerves within the central nervous system, and that's what we see on the MRI scans. So once that wedge happened, once the initial mechanism of action of the interferons was recognized, and Copaxone as well, that led to a cascade of new therapeutics to the point where we are now, which is, some 25 to 30 years on, where we actually have really good treatments now for relapsing remitting MS. So the people that I see now compared to when I started in my clinical practice in Ireland, which is in the mid-90s, it's just so different. When I was seeing people in the mid-90s, you know, we'd say you have MS, there's a drug that we can use. There's series of drugs, they're injections that make you sick. Nobody's going to be abusing these drugs because they're getting high on them. They're not pleasant drugs to take. But we think we can control your MS to some extent. To the conversations that I have now with people saying, you have MS, there's about 20 drugs there. We'll be able to control this. There's not going to be a problem. You can live your life. If you have a little flare and we can see changes in your scan, we'll change your drug. You can expect to change your drug 3 or 4 times during the course of your MS, but we don't anticipate a very significant disability with this condition. We can manage it. That's just, you know, that's just in the space of one professional lifetime. That's just mind-blowing. What we haven't done yet is been able to manage the secondary progressive form of MS, because we know that the immunological processes in that part of MS are a little bit different and they're not as well worked out. And the other form of MS, which is no relapses but just slowly getting a little bit worse, we haven't really got a good handle on that yet. But it's only a matter of time, because at the same time that our technologies are improving in terms of diagnosing MS, predicting what's going to happen to people, there are advances all the time in our understanding of how the immune system works and the complexity of that and the regulations that are happening, in addition to our understanding of what's happening within the central nervous system and the complexity of that in terms of what's happening around the inflammation that's happening within the central nervous system that we couldn't have even encountered, you know, 15 years ago, 30 years ago, but even 15 years ago. And the ways and the technologies that we have now to measure the disease, so much more refined and so much more accurate than they were in the past. So, and I've sat back in awe during my professional life, and walking the walk with people who have MS, from, you know, you have MS, I have drugs, they're not great, but I can probably stop you getting secondary progressive MS for a period of time too. You have MS, you can get on with your life. I can give you something, you know, we can make this not be a problem.